Welcome back to the Laura Coates Show. Here's your host, Laura Coates.
Hey, welcome back to the Laura Coates Show right here on SiriusXM POTUS. I know many of you are probably waking up from the Golden Globes late night or maybe looking forward to tonight's national title game between Michigan and Washington. I don't know who you're rooting for, but there's a lot ahead today. And of course, that's the nice part of the week. Congress is back in session. There is a debate coming up later in the week. We've got all the issues on the border. And of course, the issues of funding are still very much on us as well. Tomorrow, a huge day in terms of legal news for the former President Donald Trump, an oral argument about whether his appeal regarding issues like immunity and beyond will result in him winning those particular arguments. A lot to talk about. We'll bring you the very latest here on SiriusXM POTUS. Joining us now is Congressman Byron Donalds out of Florida's 19th Congressional District. He's a Republican, and you can find him on social at Byron Donalds. He's on several committees, including the Oversight and Accountability, Financial Services, just to name a few. He joins us now. Welcome back to Congress and Washington this week, Congressman Donalds. How are you?
Hey, good morning, Laura. How are you?
You've got your work cut out for you, as your colleagues do. Let's talk first about what's happened over the weekend. We're hearing that there might be some deal in principle about the looming shutdown. Is it true? What's the latest?
Well, the Speaker has contacted Republican members about an agreement on top-line funding. And so what that's going to do is give the ability for the Appropriations Committee members to go and finalize what a conferenced an agreement budget essentially is going to be between House and Senate on the various aspects of the federal government. I mean, look, but I'm going to cut straight to the point on this. There are members who are having serious questions and doubts about spending this much money. I mean, we're going to be $1.7 trillion in deficit this year, and we are not involved in a hot war. There is no pandemic, but we're running almost a $2 trillion deficit. Like that doesn't make any sense. The federal agencies are spending somewhere between 20 and 40% more today than they were spending before COVID-19. And so if you're going to have massive deficits like this and your spending levels are up in agencies where it's not really needed because you're not in a pandemic or whatever the case might be, then we got to find ways to cut more spending. And we're not doing that. We're actually doing the opposite. We're increasing spending with this top line agreement.
So where should the spending cuts happen and how do you get there?
Well, actually, they should happen across the board. You have to look at every agency. They've all been plussed up 20, 30%. You can look at places like HHS. You can look at places like the financial sector regulators, SEC, CFTC, et cetera. They all got bump ups in funding when Nancy Pelosi was Speaker of the House. And that's something that's just not sustainable. In Washington right now, Laura, we are spending we're receiving in tax revenue $5 trillion, give or take. We've never raised that much money in tax revenue in the history of the country. We're raising it now. So if you're getting in about $5 trillion and you're still running a $1.7 trillion deficit, you really got to start tightening your belt. That's the thing that's going to continue to cause issues for the American people going forward.
Well, first, the Freedom Caucus in a statement just yesterday, as you know, called the agreement a total failure. Totally unacceptable. That's their quote. I want to give some of the numbers and have you respond in terms of what this proposed deal looks like. It allows for $886.3 billion in defense spending, $772.7 billion in domestic discretionary spending. It rescinds $6.1 billion in coronavirus emergency spending authority, accelerates cuts from $80 billion in new funding that the IRS was supposed to get under the 2022 Inflation Reduction Act, and it also strips $20 billion of that total this year. Let's focus on the IRS, for a moment on these numbers. Is that the appropriate target to cut?
Yes, it should be one of the first things. But we have a bigger target than even the IRS fund. First of all, like I just said to you, we are raising record revenue into the federal government. So more IRS agents and more IRS capacity is not our problem as a country. Considering the fact that we're already overspending, one of the things we probably should do if you want to ensure tax compliance is actually simplify the code, not add more agents. So that's one. The biggest pot of money that's sitting out there, Laura, that has to be cut down are the subsidies for the Green New Deal stuff that passed in the so-called Inflation Reduction Act. The estimates from Wall Street are that those tax subsidies are going to be worth about $1.3 trillion to $2 trillion that we're going to borrow. That money's not going to be something that the taxpayer is going to fork over to green energy companies. The United States is going to borrow that money for the Green New Deal, and the energy technology that it promotes doesn't even work consistently over a long period of time. And I will also argue is not green. It's actually more dirty to the environment than if you burned natural gas. And that's a fact. So those are two areas where you could also pull back funding from. The third thing I will say is if you go budget by budget, and I've done that work. If you go budget by budget, there is room to cut these agencies down. Spending $770 billion in the federal agencies to do what? To continue to just process bad decisions and bad ideas for the American people. We have a Department of Homeland Security that's not even doing its job. And Republicans agree with providing more funding to Homeland, but Homeland's got to do the job of securing the Homeland. That's not even happening, Laura.
I want to get to that point just in a moment, and be it far from me to defend taxation totally. I am like everyone else, and certainly when I get my tax bill, I bang my head against a wall, as many people do. But I understand the need to obviously fund and finance aspects of the government. Can you just respond to a concern that some raise whenever there's an attack on the IRS? And that is, well, hold on. If taxation is our primary mechanism in many ways to generate the funds we need as a society, then can you respond to the critique that suggests that by cutting funding to the IRS, you risk cutting the ability to get those taxes?
Well, first of all, we're not going to be cutting the ability to get taxes in. When you have this plus up in money for the IRS, the purpose is for them to spend more time auditing middle-class families, small business owners, etc. Because large companies and rich people, they get audited all the time anyway. When you increase the size of the IRS, it's only to try to find every possible nickel change in the couch cushions for the federal government. I said earlier, if you actually want better tax compliance, then you simplify the tax code. A simplified code ensures more compliance because it's easy for everybody to understand and follow. And frankly, it's also easier to find if somebody's cheating. But when you have a complicated tax code like we have, where there's not one person in the country who fully understands the code, that's a problem. So we would get more bang for our buck if we had a simplified code and less enforcement than having the complicated tax code we have right now and then just increasing the number of agents.
Let's go down to the border because, as you know, some of your colleagues were there just last week, and it continues to be a crisis. I mean, you see the photos coming in, the images, the video. Many describe it as the floodwaters, fire hose, just the pure influx. Mayorkas is obviously on the hot seat. You and I have spoken in the past about possibly seeking an impeachment against him. That's now much more in the works. What is the latest there, and what is the likelihood that he could be impeached fully?
Well, first of all, I think the likelihood is pretty high that he's going to be impeached. The reason why is because he's perjured himself in front of Congress. He has lied to Congress about border security and what's actually happening on the ground. And for all of his obfuscations about how they have a plan and the border is secure and blah, 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 the American people see otherwise. The facts are otherwise, especially when you go down to the border. And the only reason why he's down there now is because the problem is so bad now in a presidential election year that Joe Biden and the administration have to try to show some semblance of work to fix the problem. But this has been going on 3 years. 3 years of this, Laura. It's just that now everybody's seeing the imagery of the massive waves, and the massive waves can end tomorrow. All it takes is for Joe Biden to rescind his border security protocols. He could do that tomorrow if he wanted to. But the fact that he refuses to secure our country is one of the main reasons why Alejandro Mayorkas is on the hot seat. He had to lie to Congress about whether the border is secure or not. He's not been telling the truth, and I think members are going to hold him accountable for that.
If Mayorkas is removed, I mean, obviously we're 300 days away from a general election, but if he is removed, do you think that actually solves the problem, or is he kind of a straw man in that scenario? Or a scapegoat, I guess is the better word, excuse me.
I'll be clear. I think he's a straw man. I think Alejandro Mayorkas, although he's lied, that is high crimes and misdemeanors. He should be impeached. You're not allowed to perjure yourself in Congress. It's a criminal offense. That being said, The reality is, until Joe Biden decides to do something different, the border is going to remain the same. And so I want some of your listeners, they're independent voters, they're Democrat voters. Joe Biden is allowing the border to be open. He is doing this because of the way he has decided to open up asylum and open up a bunch of different programs where people are getting processed at the southern border, which is an illegal point of entry, as opposed to applying for asylum in their home country or having to remain in Mexico until their case can be adjudicated. Joe Biden changed all of that. He is the one that's allowing people to go to every city of the United States. Like, I've heard the arguments from the mayor of Chicago about how, this is Greg Abbott just sending people to Chicago. That's not totally true. The Department of Homeland Security, the Office of Refugee Resettlement, they're giving migrants bus tickets, plane tickets when they leave processing centers on our southern border, and they're being sent to whatever city they choose to go to. That's what's happened in America since Joe Biden's been president. So, yeah, Alejandro Mayorkas should be held accountable, but voters need to understand very clearly all this is happening because Joe Biden has allowed it. He's the one that can stop it immediately. And if he chooses not to stop it, House Republicans have a responsibility to use every leverage point possible to hold him accountable.
Is one of those leverage points tying the aid for Ukraine to the border security?
Yes. My view is anything that Joe Biden and the Democrats want has to be used as leverage to secure our southern border. If we just went through the process of trying to find bipartisan solutions on Ukraine, the same talking points out of Washington, if we went through the process and did all that and then had these orderly conversations and put a bill on the floor and you had about 150 Democrats vote for it and 100 Republicans vote for it and it passed and it went to Joe Biden's desk, the southern border wouldn't be secured. There would be Alejandro Mayorkas wouldn't be down there now. The reason he's down there now is because House Republicans have said there is going to be no talk on Ukraine until the border is secure. The reason why you're having such concern about a potential, I believe, a partial government shutdown, because I think the military will be funded and they should be funded, a partial government shutdown is because the border is unsecure. This is about leverage negotiations now. This is not about just pure policy academic arguments. The border must be secured. And so we got to use every leverage point to make sure that happens.
Let me ask you quickly before you have to go about the 14th Amendment and, of course, Donald Trump. We know this has been top of mind. Tomorrow he's got a big oral argument in front of the D.C. Circuit Court about whether he has immunity based on actions taken while in office. It's obviously a large and nuanced issue and quite novel for a number of reasons. But there's a huge push right now, Congressman, to try to not only remove him from the ballot, but to keep him off the ballot in places like Colorado, Maine. Now, he's already back on those ballots in Colorado because the appeal that his legal team filed triggered him to be back on it. But the larger issue is, and he has said, removing him from the ballot takes away the voters' ability to try to make their own decisions. How do you see it?
I think President Trump is right. Trying to remove him from the ballot disenfranchises millions of voters. That's exactly what it does. I know my Democrat colleagues like to use the word fascism all the time. But when you remove your political opponent from the ballot and nothing has been adjudicated in the court of law, that is a fascist maneuver. That's what occurred with the Colorado State Supreme Court, and that's what happened with the Secretary of State in Maine. And so I think that what they're trying to do is actually going to backfire on them because it's just gross unfairness. We're in the middle of a presidential election year. Donald Trump is the leading person for the next president. He's beating Joe Biden in the polls, and he's beating every other Republican like a drum in the polls. To remove him from the ballot and not give the voters of this country an ability to, frankly, adjudicate the future of Donald Trump at the ballot box is disenfranchising at the highest level. It is election interference at the highest level, and it demonstrates frankly, how radical elements of the Democrat Party have become. And that's the agenda that's hurting our country.
I mean, he absolutely is, according to polling and some of the points he seems to be edging over his opponents on the Republican side. He is the runaway candidate to get that RNC nomination. But there's the other issue, Congressman, and that is about the immunity aspect. The question is, do you think that he ought to be, or a president generally ought to be immunized from prosecution for anything they've done while in office?
Well, I think this is very clear. He's talking about his actions to essentially execute the take care clause, the faithfully take care clause of the Constitution. So much is talked about equal protection under the law and the Constitution. That is true. But the executive also has a responsibility to do everything to faithfully execute the laws of the land. He views that President Trump is viewing that his actions post-election were to ensure that the election process was a fair one. And so to criminalize that when he's trying to execute his duties is wrong. That's the basis of his immunity case. Personally, I agree with that argument, because even if you look at the actions and pull the politics away and look at the actions of the administration, did he go and rip new ballots and drop new ballots in the box in Georgia? No, he did not. He worked through the Secretary of State. Did he have his legal team as a candidate for that office try to find any possible way to see if there were more votes to better his outcome? That's within the process of being a candidate for any office, especially President of the United States. So I think that the legal cases around this are junk. They are trash cases. And the reason why they're bringing those cases is because you have radical elements of the Democrat Party who want to use the legal system to take down their political opponent. That is the most un-American thing that has occurred in this country that I have ever seen. You're not allowed to use the law to tear down your political opponents. They do that in third world countries. I think the president should be immunized for what he did, because he wasn't. If you go back, like I said, if you go back and you look at it objectively, he wasn't stuffing ballot boxes. He wasn't pulling ballots out. None of that occurred. They were going through the process of trying to find every possible way to see if he had the votes he needed to be victorious. Every candidate does that, Laura. Every candidate. People need to understand that.
Well, I'll be curious to see if the Court of Appeals sees it the way you do based on the evidence presented. And, of course, their issue is not a full trial, just so we're clear for tomorrow. I know you're not making that trial case, but it's about whether, generally speaking, a president can experience that immunity. I'll be curious what arguments they raise, whether they're similar to what you have. And, of course, we can remember Jack Smith did not charge the president with insurrection. There is the Fulton County case, but there's a larger issue as to whether all actions by a president, even in looking in the most favorable light, should be immunized. Congressman, thank you for joining us this morning. I'm sure there's a lot more to talk about. We'll have you back again. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you.
Again, that hearing will happen tomorrow, and we'll unpack that further, including the legal arguments made by Trump's team as to whether and why he believes he should have immunity. Of course, the criteria for immunity when we're talking about a president of the United States, we're talking about pretty novel territory in terms of actions performed while in office. The Court of Appeals is not going to have a trial on the merits with respect to the facts underlying the claims, but whether the legal arguments about immunity for a president while conducting office should stand. I will be doing special coverage tomorrow on CNN with my colleague Caitlin Collins tomorrow from 9 to noon. So do look for me there. We'll unpack all these issues further, and we will get you as informed as possible. I got to go to a quick break right here on SiriusXM POTUS. We'll be right back.
This is POTUS.